Lawrence, Lessig, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Orson. So I want to tell you about something which very few people have focused on, and that's probably a good thing because that means big money has been ignoring it as well. But it's good news that's going to come out of Maine after the upcoming election, regardless of who wins the presidency, and it affects the possibility to deal with super PACs. So I want to introduce the idea of super PACs and help you to see exactly why there's a real chance that we could get rid of them, even without changing the Supreme Court, or more precisely with this Supreme Court. So in the United States, we take it for granted that campaigns are going to be privately funded, which of course raises some obvious concerns. In the ordinary case, the contribution that is made to a political candidate is made by somebody who is simply wanting the candidate to prevail. It's just a desire that their ideas might be advanced. And there's no problem with that under the law. But of course, sometimes the concern is that especially large contributions are given in exchange for some kind of quid pro quo, some kind of deal. And the law views that exchange as illegal. And that illegal exchange is referred to as a kind of quid pro quo. And that quid pro quo, therefore, defines what we think of as a corrupt contribution. And what the Supreme Court has said about these corrupt contributions, these quid pro quo contributions, since 1976, is that Congress has the power to regulate, to avoid the risk of that quid pro quo contribution. And the particular regulation is the shrinking of the size of contributions. So if the contribution is small enough, the idea that you would be asking for a quid pro quo in response to it would be a joke. Now, critically, what the Supreme Court said in 1976 is, when asked by the people challenging that law, why isn't bribery law enough? The Supreme Court said, you can regulate bribery, but you can also regulate beyond bribery. You can regulate to limit the size of contributions so that there's no bribery that anybody could reasonably expect, so that the public could have confidence that the system is not a system where the richest are buying government favors. So the first lesson, the first principle that comes out of this case is, if there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption, then Congress may regulate that political speech to avoid the risk of quid pro quo corruption. Second point is this. Imagine you have a politician, and then you have somebody who's trying to support the politician, but the person supporting the politician is completely independent of the politician, no coordination at all. We call this independent speech. Buckley versus Vallejo considered this case too, because the law that Buckley was reviewing purported to limit how much people could speak or spend to speak independently of a political campaign. And what the court said in Buckley was, you can't limit the speech of people spending independently of a campaign. And then in Citizens United in 2010, the court extended that principle to corporations and to unions. And the basic reason for this extension was that there is no risk of quid pro quo corruption when the speech is independent, or put the other way around, if the speech involves a quid pro quo, if there's a deal between the speaker and the politician, then it's not independent speech. So long as the speech is independent, it can't be regulated. This is lesson 2 that the Supreme Court is attempting to teach us. Okay, this is where stuff gets interesting. 3 months after the Supreme Court decided Citizens United, a lower federal court addressed a related question. What happens when a political action committee is spending money independently of a candidate? Buckley had said that an individual can't be limited, and Citizens United had said corporations and unions couldn't be limited. It followed from that reasoning that a political action committee also can't be limited in its spending so long as its spending is independent of a political campaign. So this independent political action committee, of course, needs to raise money. And so imagine it tries to raise this money from an individual. The individual says to the political action committee, look, I'll give you $1 million if you advertise in favor of the widget bill. And the political action committee says, okay. Now, that's a quid pro quo between the political action committee and the rich person. But of course, that quid pro quo is totally okay because it involves no quid pro quo with the politician. So what a lower federal court said in 2010, the DC Circuit, was that this kind of contribution, a contribution to a political action committee, cannot be regulated because the image inside the head of the judges was the image on this screen, that the Political Action Committee is independent of the candidate, and the contribution to the Political Action Committee, the court thought, would also, as a matter of logic, be independent of the candidate. And so once the DC Circuit, the kind of king of the circuit, spoke, all the other circuits that considered the question after this agreed and said that political action committees that receive contributions can't be limited in the size of the contributions that they receive. Now, what I want to say, or what many have tried to begin to articulate, is just exactly why this argument is wrong. And to see why it's wrong, it's important to just take this picture and change it subtly. So imagine that the rich person's not speaking to the Political Action Committee. Imagine the rich person is speaking to the politician directly. And what the rich person says to the politician is, I'll give you a contribution. I'll give your super PAC a contribution as long as you do some favor to me. Okay, now that do something for the politician is quid pro quo corruption. This transaction in the red box is quid pro quo corruption. But the corruption involves a contribution to the super PAC. And so what the DC Circuit had said in this case speech now in 2010, the case that created super PACs, what the DC Circuit said was impossible, turns out to be conceptually possible. And then in 2015, in a case involving one of my favorite United States senators, Robert Menendez, we saw how the possible became real. Because in 2015, Robert Menendez was indicted. The indictment was he engaged in a quid pro quo corruption with some Florida businessman. The promise was he would give favors to the Florida businessman. And in exchange for those favors, the Florida businessman would make a contribution to Menendez's super PAC. And when that contribution was made, that constituted a contribution to a super PAC involving quid pro quo corruption. Menendez was indicted for this. His lawyers had the chutzpah to file a motion to dismiss, saying, the thing you've accused me of, the DC Circuit said was impossible. But of course, the court didn't dismiss it because what was he's charged with was not just possible, it in fact happened, but it demonstrated the mistake in the DC Circuit's opinion. Here was quid pro quo corruption involving a contribution to a super PAC. What the court had said was impossible was in fact possible. It was a possible risk. And if this principle that the Supreme Court has articulated is true, if there's a risk of quid pro quo corruption, then it means that the states must have the possibility to regulate to avoid this risk of quid pro quo corruption. So this possibility, you might say, is it likely? Well, Buckley versus Vallejo was talking about a risk in the context of a direct contribution. But you might say, how often is a gift to a super PAC really the product of a quid pro quo corruption? And the answer is when the contributors are giving millions, and in one case, $1 billion contribution to the super PAC, it's pretty obvious that most people would think that there is a pretty significant risk that there's a quid pro quo corruption. Indeed, Donald Trump earlier this year gave a speech before a bunch of oil executives, and he explicitly said, if you raise $1 billion for me, then I will roll back regulations on your industry day one when I'm elected to the presidency. Now, the only way to give $1 billion to Donald Trump's campaign is to give it to his super PACs. So there was an explicit invocation, again, of the idea that you could have a quid pro quo with a contribution to a super PAC. And our suggestion is most people would think that if the contributions are of that size, they are certainly involving a risk of quid pro quo corruption. Indeed, right now, you can be limited in the size of the contribution you can make to the candidate's campaign directly at just $3,000. So if there's a risk of corruption with a contribution to a campaign of just $3,000, obviously there's a risk of a corruption and a contribution to a super PAC of millions of dollars. So it's madness right now that both of these can't be regulated. If one can be regulated, then both should be able to be regulated, and they should be able to be regulated in both cases by shrinking the size of the contributions that can be made, both with candidate contributions and contributions to super PACs. This much should be obvious. So here's the summary of what I've tried to show you here. Supreme Court has expressly said you could have regulations of contributions when and only when they create a risk of quid pro quo corruption. Large contributions to candidates create the risk of quid pro quo corruption. That's why since 1976, court has upheld the ability to limit those contributions. This risk is the quid pro quo corruption risk, so that means they can be regulated. Large contributions to super PACs create that same risks. And that risk is the risk of quid pro quo corruption. So obviously, they should be able to be regulated too. The DC Circuit is wrong. And what we're hoping is that we can begin to convince at least one circuit that the DC Circuit is wrong and get us a chance to get the Supreme Court to address this question. Okay, so here's where Maine comes into the story. Maine has an initiative on its November ballot, an initiative to limit contributions to independent political action committees, or so-called SuperPACs. The initiative just says the most you can give to these political action committees that make independent expenditures is $5,000. That's the same limit that the federal law had imposed that the DC Circuit struck down in 2010. When the Maine passes this initiative on November 5th, polling right now is at about 70% in support of the initiative. It will be challenged in December. We expect a large number of super PAC type entities to challenge it. It will be decided first by a district court, we're hoping by the summer of 2025, and then it will go up to the Court of Appeals immediately, and we think by January of 2026, the Court of Appeals could address it. Now, the Court of Appeals that will oversee this decision is the First Circuit Court of Appeals. That court has never decided the question whether super PACs are constitutionally required. So there's an opportunity for the court to consider this question for the first time. And in light of what we've learned since that extraordinary mistake 14 years ago, we believe the Court of Appeals will agree with us that super PACs are not constitutionally mandated. And when they agree with us, that will give and decide in that favor, that will force the United States Supreme Court to take the case, because that means there'll be a conflict between the lower federal courts. And when the United States Supreme Court takes the case, we think the court could decide this likely after the next midterm election, so let's say December 2026. And in the Supreme Court, the argument will simply be, apply your existing jurisprudence to facts you've never considered. So that means we're not saying overturn Citizens United. We're not saying we need you to extend your law to adopt new principles. We're saying, apply the very principles that you have been applying since Citizens United in every one of these contexts, the principles that say the only basis for regulating political speech is the risk of quid pro quo corruption. Apply it to facts you've never had the chance to review, namely whether large contributions to independent political action committees raise the risk of quid pro quo corruption. The cynical read is we lose because the Supreme Court always goes against anybody who's trying to limit big money in politics. But my read is we win. I think we win with 7-2, both because it's right on the law and because I think it's right on the politics that the Supreme Court will see by the time this case gets to them. And the two bits of that politics argument are, number one, the Supreme Court will recognize what most people in politics now recognize, that super PACs don't benefit either side, that both sides deploy them. Indeed, 2020, the Democrats spent more in super PAC money than the Republicans. So it's just an arms race. It's an arms race that's not benefiting either side, so there's nothing essential to a partisan vision of supporting this to support your partisan side. That's number one. And number two, the Supreme Court is increasingly eager to find ways to demonstrate that it's not just a bunch of right-wing crazies. And here would be a surprise that they could offer, saying our principles produce the result that super PACs are not mandated by Madison's First Amendment. And I think they will be motivated to reach that conclusion. And when they reach that conclusion, it will be the end of super PACs, because that decision applied to the Maine law will revive the federal law. So just like when the Supreme Court struck down Roe versus Wade and all these state laws limiting abortion came back to life, when the Supreme Court upholds the Maine law, the DC Circuit's decision suppressing the federal law will be effectively reversed, and the federal law limiting contributions to independent political action committees will also come back to life. And so it will come back to life and end technically without Congress needing to do anything super PACs. And Congress, of course, can decide if it wants to change that, but then we have to begin the incredible fight to make sure that Congress keeps the law as it is so that we can end this deeply corrupting political action committee, political money inside of our political system. So that's the argument. They would love to have support. Citizens to endsuperpacs.org. They have a weekly phone bank reaching out to voters, and what's really great about the phone bank is, unlike the typical phone banking where you get somebody who hates what you're trying to talk to them about, overwhelmingly people are like, hell yes,